It's the real news. I'm Varna Noor. Lori Lightfoot, a former federal prosecutor, was sworn in as Chicago's mayor on Monday, becoming the first Black woman and openly queer person to hold the position. And she's already making big promises. Days before she was sworn in, after reading briefings from her transition team, Lightfoot pledged that the city will eliminate water shutoffs, a practice that's affected tens of thousands of Chicago families who are struggling to pay their increasing water bills.
Water is a basic human right. If you're turning off water, you are effectively evicting people. And we know that that disproportionately affects low-income people of color who are going to be shut off from water services.
The price of water in Chicago has tripled in the last decade. Here to talk about this is Jenya Polozova, who is Food and Water Watch's Midwest organizer. Thank you so much for joining me, Jenya.
Thanks for having me.
So this comes after, earlier this year, WBEZ and American Public Media put out an investigation that found that some 150,000 households have gotten water shutoff notices in the past 12 years in Chicago. Of course, disproportionately Black and Latinx families. Just to put this in perspective, talk about what happens when a family gets one of these notices. How behind on your bills do you have to be to get one? How are families affected by shutoffs? How do you get your water turned back on?
Yeah, so once families are unable to pay, the water department will shut their water off. And the timing of the reconnection can vary, but it mainly depends on your ability to pay the bill. So for example, there's a lot of different barriers that families have to jump through to get their water reconnected. There's a $40 fee to reinstall water services. In order to access the reconnection of their water bill, residents are also charged a 1.25% penalty of the amount owed. And also, if they want to get on a payment plan in order to repay that water bill, they have to come up with half that money owed in order to receive a payment plan. They can pay 25% if they can prove that they are disabled or elderly, but some people haven't been able to afford even that. So illegal reconnections have actually outpaced legal reconnections in the past 6 years. There's been about over 60,000 illegal reconnections.
Wow.
And if you're caught, you have to pay a $500 fee to the water department.
And that's on top of the price of water, which has tripled again in the past decade, which is, I guess, a part of why so many people are getting their water shut off for non-payment. How does Chicago justify that rapidly increasing rate? Is the city transparent at all about what they need that increased revenue for or where it's going?
Somewhat. So a lot of it has to do with outdated water infrastructure. So to put that into perspective, even though we live next to one of the largest sources of water in the United States, we pay more for water than the city of Phoenix that pipes its water from 300 miles away. So it's not the water that's expensive, but the cost of maintaining our water infrastructure. And Chicago required the use of lead service lines between street, mains, and homes until Congress banned the practice in 1986. Much of our water infrastructure is decades old and needs to be replaced. The other issue is that there has been a huge decline in federal support for water infrastructure that has dropped by 70% since the 1970s, and that places the burden on municipalities like Chicago to cover the cost of improving the water infrastructure. So there was a first rate hike in 2011 that was phased in over several years with the goal of improving water infrastructure. The second rate hike, which began in 2016, was actually to generate money for the city's pension fund. So the city has been transparent somewhat in terms of what we need that money for.
Yeah, and I should say part of the reason that I'm so interested in this happening in Chicago is that I've been covering water affordability here in Baltimore. And a really common practice here has been issuing liens on people's homes over unpaid water bills. Those liens can get sold at annual tax sales, and that means essentially people can lose their homes for not paying their water bills. And that practice was just banned due to a piece of state legislation. But some city officials, specifically folks in the Department of Public Works who control water, for instance, were opposed to that ban because they said that they'd be losing an important source of revenue. And that revenue, they say, was necessary to, as you're saying in Chicago, make these really important infrastructural repairs to Baltimore's water and sewage system, which, like yours, it's decades old in some places. Have you seen that kind of pushback from city officials in Chicago? Is anyone concerned that this ban on water shutoffs could negatively impact the city financially because they'll have one less way to get people to pay their bills?
That was an initial concern, but actually last summer we did a couple of hearings for many members of the Chicago City Council where we had Roger Colton, who's a utility expert, come in and talk about how people really can't pay the water. We can't generate revenue on bills that people cannot afford to pay. And we actually advocated for an income-based billing program so that people can at least pay a portion of the bill. But when the city levies this really high water bills, when the city shuts off people's water, it has to spend more money on trying to get people to pay their fines, sending people out to legally reconnect the water service. So we actually have encountered that argument, but don't find it to be a viable argument.
Yeah, Roger Colton actually did a similar study of Baltimore, and I know that Alderman Carlos Ramirez-Rosa introduced an ordinance a couple of years ago that would, again, cap water bills for low-income households in Chicago. Talk about what Mayor Lori Lightfoot could do to support that, as she says that she, of course, thinks that water is a human right and should be affordable to all Chicagoans.
Yeah, so there are two particular pieces of the ordinance that we think Mayor Lightfoot could support. So one of the pieces is it would establish a Water for All program that would provide financial relief to low-income households. So based on how much money they receive annually, they can get a credit back on their water bill either once a year or twice a year. The other piece of that bill that we believe Mayor Lightfoot could support is that it requires a plan to ensure there is equitable and just implementation of capital improvements to the water system, making sure that money is going to the areas that have been neglected in the past. And this plan would be developed collaboratively with an advisory board of stakeholders. This can include public health agencies, organizations, labor unions, and nonprofit organizations to ensure that this plan is carried out. So we think it's really, really great that Mayor Lightfoot has taken this great step to end water shutoffs in Chicago, but we still need to implement income-based billing to ensure that the rising water rates aren't disproportionately impacting low-income communities in Chicago.
And once this ban goes into effect, are there other collections methods that you think that the city might use to try to get people to pay these high bills?
From my understanding, penalties could still be implemented. So, for example, right now the city has over $7 million in unpaid fines and fees. Nearly $2 million of those penalties were issued in the city's 10-4 zip code. So, from my understanding, that's one of the collection methods the city could use to try to get people to pay their water bills quicker.
And of course, this isn't just a problem in Chicago. Water bills are climbing all across the country. And a study from your organization, from Food and Water Watch, showed that an estimated 15 million Americans actually got their water shut off because of non-payment a few years ago in 2016. Could this promise for Mayor Lightfoot sort of spark other ones? Could we see national reverberations of this?
I definitely hope so, and I especially hope this will bolster the case for water affordability legislation in Detroit and other Midwest cities like Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Columbus that are in proximity to Great Lakes, but whose water bills are rising nonetheless. For example, something like 17,000 households in Detroit had their water shut off last year. And to sort of put in perspective in Chicago, we've also seen that like Philadelphia has implemented an income-based affordability program, that Baltimore has been water privatization, and those examples have been really encouraging in our conversations when we talk to aldermen organizations. So we certainly hope that Chicago can do the same for other cities.
What exactly would Mayor Lightfoot have to do to make good on this promise? Like what, processes would she have to go through the city's government to actually ensure that this becomes a reality?
So I can't say I'm entirely sure on what that process would take, but given that the water department is under Mayor Lightfoot control, we hope that she can implement a water affordability program within the water department and ensure that there's equitable and just implementation of capital improvements. And Mayor Lightfoot can also support the Water for All ordinance when Alderman Rosa introduces it later this year.
And when she does do that, when she actually does make good on this promise, talk about the kind of support that she has from Chicagoans.
Yeah, so there's actually been about 30 Chicago organizations that have already signed on to a letter to the Chicago City Council and the mayor in support of the Water for All ordinance that Alderman Rosa introduced in 2017, including our partner organization, Southsiders Organized for Unity and Liberation, with whom we've been doing a lot of work on this ordinance. So there's definitely broad support across the city for water affordability legislation and equity in terms of investing into our water system.
Okay, well, as we see what Mayor Lightfoot does to make this a reality, we'd love to talk to you again. So please keep us in the loop. Again, Jenya Polozova is Food and Water Watch's Midwest organizer. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.